afternoon, everybody. It seems to me that no matter where you look in the world, the question of freedom and determinism lurks in the background. And I don't think there's ever been a time since modernity, since the beginning of modern times, when there have been so many intellectual currents in the air that all signal the idea that human subjectivity is a very sort of false, flawed idea that we should, in a sense, marginalize. I don't think anybody, or certainly no intellectually serious currents, dare say that human subjectivity is entirely a fantasy, something that we shouldn't really take seriously at all. But by and large, what we have is a situation where there's a very limited, minor role that's given to the role of people in the making of their lives and in the making of their circumstances. When I look at, for example, the new kinds of histories that are becoming increasingly fashionable, you take something like what I call, I don't even know if it's a name, but I call it environmental history, which are basically histories of the planet, which have as their epistemological sort of ideal of going back as far as possible to the beginnings of time. Because of course, the more you go into the beginnings of time, the less you see the human as a distinct entity. And the number of times I hear these new historians tell us, oh, we've overrated the role of human beings, when they're just a little speck on the planetary sort of scheme of things. And of course, the more you go back into pre-human times, and the more that history moves into that domain, the less you see the role of humanity, for the very simple reason that it's biologically non-existent. And I don't think it's an accident that there's this preoccupation with pre-human history. And the very fact that that's even called history, I think is quite interesting, because once you begin to move into the domain of nature, that kind of prehistorical sense, then of course all these arguments become justifiable. In the course of the last couple of days, people have made allusions to the influence of evolutionary psychology. I know Ellie earlier talked about the beginnings of evolutionary morality in the 19th century as it developed its social Darwinism. And pretty much the same kind of ideas that existed in the 19th century are kind of repackaged in this new psychology that is extremely fashionable and transcends the whole ideological divide. You have, these days it's impossible to pick up a newspaper without there being an article that says, research shows that and brain science says that you're hardwired to do this or that you thought that you actually made your own ethical decision, but we now know that it's this side of your brain working on that side of your head that is actually responsible for making ethical decisions. And literally, there is no aspect of the human sort of imagination that is left for people to make decisions about. The idea of volition, of will, of voluntariness, is all pretty much in the background. In a way that even the Romans or the Greeks sort of found weary and weird. So when you think about it, even the Romans understood that although there is fortuna, there is fate, nevertheless within that there are sort of bits of your life that you do have a degree of control over. And there was a kind of a real struggle even in Roman times and going all the way forward since then. And people try to carve out for themselves a particular sort of space within which human beings can make their own way, where decisions could be made, where morality counted in every respect. Now, the starting point for, I think, this whole weekend, and certainly for this lecture, and something that we touched upon beforehand, is that for some time now, humanity has been uncomfortable, maybe even estranged from the idea of freedom. not rhetorically, because rhetorically we always talk about freedom, and we talk about free societies and all the rest of that, but in a very fundamental sense, become very, really estranged from it. And historically we know that the first important expressions of this were in the last third of the 19th century, when you have the beginnings of a reaction to the consequences of the Enlightenment, when people begin to kind of draw back from the optimistic prognosis that was being made by the Enlightenment thinkers and begin to worry about the irrationality or the non-rationality of human behavior. But it's in the interwar period that it really does gain a mass force. It's in the interwar period where, for example, you begin to argue that actually not only are human beings irrational, they're irrational in a very pathological sense, where there are arguments that we have characteristics that are formed as a result of our socialization that dispose us towards being passive, characteristics that makes us almost fascist-like. This is where where the ideas of the authoritarian personality, as somebody mentioned a couple of hours ago, really originate from, when the argument is that there are people whose very socialization, the way they've been brought up within the family, so the family as such, never mind socialization, is itself responsible for that dependency that children have on their parents, which when recast on a wider scale, demonstrates that they never gain the agency to properly take charge of their circumstances. And I think it's in this context that the existentialist creed occurred about freedom should really be heard. It's in this period, in the 30s, when you have more and more skepticism about modern thought, when you have the rise of fascism and of all these totalitarian movements, when you don't see any democratic possibilities, when freedom does seem to be on the defensive physically, it's actually not challenged in ways that would have been unthinkable beforehand. It's in this period that existentialism, or people who are drawn towards existentialism, begin to sort of make their voices heard. And I think Sartre is quite interesting. He's a very flawed individual, he's a very flawed character. And I could give you a lecture criticizing all his faults and say what a horrible person he is. But I could also give you a lecture that almost does the opposite and say that even though he had all these flaws, nevertheless, he had this remarkable sort of intuitive grasp of the human condition that he was able to give often a very brave sort of answer, or not answer, that's putting it too strong there, a very kind of brave sort of representation too. And I don't think it matters what Sartre set out to do. I mean, Sartre is both a philosopher and a literary figure. And I think it's just as it's very crude to ask, well, what is the author trying to do? Because the really good authors, the Joyces, the Prousts, they don't wake up one morning, brush their teeth and say, well, I'm going to do a story about human redemption, or I'm going to do they just write. And that's what Arthur Students set out, and they're at. So I don't think it's useful to say, well, what did Sartre actually set out to do? But more in terms of what he accomplished, and more in terms of what we can take from it. Or even more pertinently, what we choose to take from it. Because we have a choice, and we can decide that these are the moments in his kind of writings that are worth, sort of taking up, distilling, and using it, for our own opportunistic sort of purposes. But I think what Sartre did, or tried to accomplish in his own way, was to transcend his condition of cultural fatalism to an act of subjective will. What Sartre is, above all, is a voluntarist, a man of a voluntaristic gesture. That's really what he's doing there. And in a sense, what his philosophy tried to do was to free the human subject from the external constraints that he perceived, so that, relieved of all those impositions, man could really be free, whatever that meant, really be free. However, eschewing all values, and this was already raised yesterday in the Kierkegaard discussion, eschewing all values, Sartre could not quite give a positive account of freedom. In fact, for him, being free was not a state that could be avoided. So freedom wasn't something that you could say, I'll be something I opt for. Being free was part of the condition in which people found themselves, which is why often when you read Sartre, freedom in his account often comes across as a cross to be borne. It's something that we have to bear, not something that we just simply go to the shop and buy. It's something that is there, and it's, as you remark, man being condemned to be free carries the whole weight of the whole world on his shoulder. He is responsible for the world and for himself as a way of being. On the positive side, Sartre challenged the culture of excuses promoted by in the 1930s and the 1940s anti-liberal currents. And I think the kind of excuse culture that we have today had a more grotesque manifestation in the 1930s, where people said, well, you know, we're not responsible for the collapse of France in front of the Germans, just because we were, you know, looking at our shoelaces while, you know, so the Germans were coming in and, you know, destroying our society. Not our fault. It's, you know, it's the fault of the Popular Front, or it's the fault of somebody else. So he's really challenging that culture of excuses, you know, where there is a certain almost kind of pathological desire not to take responsibility. And he sought to forge an important relationship between freedom and responsibility, and that was really important. I always think of 1930s Stalinism, the expression that to me really sums up, you know, I mean, Stalin was really bad, you know, I can say many, many bad things about it, but for me, as an intellectual, what I find really objectionable is often when you hear old Communist Party members talking, they have this phrase that they use, which is, it's no accident, comrade. Yeah, whatever happened, oh, it's no accident that it happened. In other words, you know, there was this kind of idea that everything imaginable was predetermined. There was this kind of prior cause to that, kind of a clockwork element to that. So on the one hand, you had, it's no accident, comrade, from the Stalinists, and on the other hand, coming out of the United States, you know, at the time under the Rooseveltian New Deal, is this kind of very powerful technocratic imperative where essentially technocracy and science and all these impersonal forces, if they're only properly organized by a small group of experts, we're going to do the trick. And all of us, the rest of humanity, was spared of the responsibility of taking any responsibility or being charged of their circumstances. And that kind of post-war technological determinism, which belittled humanity's capacities for self-determination, all those things were really quite important. And you know, when you have a culture of it's no accident, comrades, Sartre comes along and he says, there are no accidents in life as well. And he says, there are no accidents in life. A community event which suddenly bursts forth and involves me, it does not come from the outside. In other words, nothing comes from the outside. I'm in some shape or form implicated in it. And it becomes, at that point, a very radical counterpoint to the fatalistic sentiments of his times. In other words, what he was arguing in the war period, and this is something that comes across in Being and Nothingness, is that we assume responsibility for the course of events to the making of choices. We assume responsibility for the course of events through the making of choices. One of the things I really loved, I remember when I first read, probably the only thing I loved, Being and Nothingness, is towards the end, I forget which chapter it's in. It's got this discussion of the way in which morality and moral rules kind of work. And the point he's really making there is that the moment you abide by moral rules, you're no longer moral, because you become so concerned with obeying the rules and following the rules, and to stop thinking for yourself. And what he's really trying to get us to think about is how, true morality requires of us to think for ourselves and to make choices for ourselves. I'd like to spend a bit of time on his infamous 1945 lecture, Existentialism is a Humanism. Now I know that Sartre said afterwards, or he reportedly said, that he wished that this lecture was never published. And a lot of people say that this lecture on existentialism is not his real thoughts, or it's a simplification of his thoughts because he was forced by all the criticism that he faced because of his novels to account for himself. This was a, I mean, I don't know if you read the accounts of the lecture, but I wish I'd been there, because essentially what he had was Sartre getting up. There's about 4,000 or 5,000 people in the audience, and all the leading intellectuals in Paris were there to give him a hard time. All these people, I read about it, the 20-year-old, Pierre Naville, and all that, they're just there, they're laying into him. And you can just imagine the intense, sort of intellectual kind of moment that could have been. And there is poor Sartre having to argue coherently, because see, as long as you write novels and as long as you write Being and Nothingness, you're not really forced to put a systematic exposition of your argument forward. Now he's forced to do that, and you can almost feel that he wishes that he didn't have to do it, because when you force to account for yourself in that way, things become a bit more exposed in terms of your own thoughts. Anyway, what he says in his lecture in 1945, Existentialism is a Humanism, is that existentialists find it extremely disturbing that God no longer exists. For along with his disappearance goes the possibility of finding values in an intelligible heaven. And what he's really getting here is that, what existentialists are confronted with, have to deal with, is the fact that there are no a priori values that can be embraced or taken taken for granted fashion. And when you have no values, then what you're also left with is a kind of freedom which is unconnected to any moral purpose. And that's to me, the real difficulty that he's kind of grappling with. You have a freedom that is not connected to any foundation. And in fact, one of the most interesting ways of getting into Sartre, that's how I get into Sartre, is that I kind of think about the problem of foundation, which is the historical problem facing human beings since history, which is what is the foundation, what is the normative basis on which human exchange and human communication and human action occurs. So you have freedom that's unconnected to any moral purpose. And at this point of his lecture, Sartre cites Dostoevsky's famous statement. I don't know if he discussed this in Jenny's lecture, I'm sure he did, when Dostoevsky says that if God does not exist, everything is permissible. Right? If God does not exist, everything is permissible. And adds at that point that this is the starting point of existentialism. Right? This is the starting point for existentialism. And what he's really doing here is one way of interpreting this statement is that the problem of foundation, that is the absence of agreed values, ought to guide the behavior of human beings, because that also is a dilemma of existence that we're confronted with. Sartre remarks at that point that if indeed everything is possible, then man is consequently abandoned, for he cannot find anything to rely on, neither within nor without. So we're left literally naked in front of all these sort of forces of the world. When we're in a situation when there's nothing that we can rely on, either from within or from without, it also means that there are no excuses. There are no ready-made excuses. For, as he says, if it's true that existence precedes essence, we can never explain our action by reference to a given immutable human nature. This, as Sartre explained, is the negation of determinism, for man is free, man is freedom. Man is free, man is freedom. And he couldn't put it more starkly, more clearly, in terms of the way that the relationship between freedom and humanity is constituted. However, what in one sense confronts us with a challenge of our freedom also presents us with the difficulty of knowing how to justify ourselves to ourselves and to others. When you have no values, when we're just there, naked, in front of the world, it doesn't mean to say that we don't have to justify ourselves. We still do. The question becomes, how do we do it? And Sartre says, if, however, God does not exist, we will encounter no values or orders that can legitimize our conduct. I think this is the key problem today, as much as in our time. How do we legitimize our conduct? This is something that we have to account for ourselves as individuals. You know, and we're continually in the business of looking for validations for our conduct. How am I going to explain myself to my friend? How am I going to explain myself to a colleague? We're always looking for legitimation of our behavior, but it's also, of course, the central problem of society. You know, what is the foundation on which claims are made to and about society? In his presentation of the philosophy of existentialism, Sartre underlines the absence of values or any means of justification or excuse. And when he stated that we are left alone and without excuses, he points to the absence of any authority that we can draw on for guidance. He states unequivocally that humanity cannot find refuge in some sign that will guide him on earth. And it is in this context, it's in this context of discussion, that is often such a statement is made that man is condemned to be free. It's in this context that a statement, man is condemned to be free, should be situated. Man is condemned because he did not create himself, yet nonetheless free, because once cast into the world, he is responsible for everything that he does. So whether we like it or not, once we're thrown in the world, you know, there's no point saying, I don't want to be here, you know, stop the world, I want to get off. That's not an option, you know, anymore. We become responsible for everything that we do. And as he argued in that lecture, man is condemned at all times to invent man. In the very weakness of being thrown into the world, we also have the glimmering of a certain power, because in a sense it is man who is called upon at all times to invent man. So I would say that even though Sartre himself doesn't come to this conclusion, he doesn't go as far as that, he kind of refuses to take to the logic of his statement. In one sense, Sartre poses freedom as a foundational norm. If freedom itself becomes the foundation, I think, on which communication, on which human interaction can be based upon. And he wrote that when I affirm that freedom under any concrete circumstances can have no other aim than itself, no other aim than itself, and once a man realizes in his own state of abandonment that it is he who imposes values, he can will but one thing: freedom as the foundation of all values. Freedom as the foundation of all values. And in a sense, he doesn't actually give up on values, because he argued that if I eliminated God as a father, there has to be someone to invent values. I think this goes back a bit to the Kierkegaard discussion yesterday, but at a slightly more intense kind of level. Because the logic of that, I mean, what Sartre has all but done, is to recast the human beings as gods who make and invent both man and their values. Now at this point he senses there's a danger. There's a danger with just talking about values in the abstract. I mean, what are these values? There's a bit of a problem here. I think he senses that the danger of turning freedom into an empty gesture through dispossessing it of any connection to any specific values. I think you almost get a sense that he realizes that if you go down that road, then you do become sort of responsible for trivializing freedom, becomes a gesture-like kind of quality. And in one of his popular pamphlets, he says, nothing can be good for us which is not good for everyone. Very clear value. And elsewhere stated, at the same time that I will own my own freedom, it is my duty to will the freedom of others. I cannot set my own freedom as a goal unless I also set that of others as my goal. Clear statement. Now Lukács, George Lukács, in his 1947 criticism of Sartre, remarked that this sounds very fine. This is a grand gesture, that he said. This kind of proposition is really nice. But he said it's an eclectic insertion into existentialism. What Lukács is saying is that what Sartre has done is that he's inserted eclectically into existentialism the principles of the Enlightenment and that of Kantian philosophy. In other words, just sort of being confronted with the potentially just sort of dead end of a system of values that is unconnected to anything, Sartre was forced to fall back upon the resources of the Enlightenment, and he kind of falls back on Kant, and this is really sort of Kant's idea of moral autonomy, and not using the categorical imperative of using people as means, but seeing them as ends. And he brings that into existentialism. And I think that observation by Lukács is actually right, that there is there's a limit as to how far you go down that road. Sartre recognizes it, and he tries to kind of somehow damage limit. In a slightly one-sided manner, Sartre holds us responsible for our action and behavior. His response to criticism that the characters in his novels were weak or cowardly, he responded to by stating that what they really objected to is that he makes no excuses for them. For example, he contrasted his orientation to Zola in the following way. He says, for if like Zola, you know Zola, the 19th century French novelist, for if like Zola we were to blame their behavior on their heredity or environmental influences, their society, or factors of an organic or psychological nature, people would be reassured and they would say, that is the way we are. No one can do anything about it. In other words, he very cleverly counterposed his novels to that of Zola, and Zola is a pretty heavy determinist guy. You do get a sense that this is a tale foretold, where the characters sometimes act. I mean, some of his novels are really quite exciting, and he means well, but there is a naturalistic counterpoint to what he's really doing. And basically he says that that's not me. I don't see that no one can do anything about it. You observe that when an existentialist describes a coward, he says that a coward is responsible for his cowardice. He made himself a coward through his action alone. I really like that. I think that kind of a real, no excuse confrontation with the human condition and responsibility for that condition is really quite fantastic. I should mention that it goes completely against the grain of 21st century Western European culture. The idea that cowards are cowards and they made themselves the cowards goes very much against the contemporary therapeutic imagination. Because the minute you would say something like that today, within 10 seconds somebody would say, but he was bullied, or a number of other kind of reasons as to it was the mother or the father or whatever. Sartre noted that people react and feel really horrified sort of when, with the idea that the coward is, as we present him, a coward. Right? That the coward is just guilty of being, that's not something that we can very easily accept, that somebody is as defined by what they've done, by that kind of behavior. And at this point he objects to materialism, because materialism from his perspective treats human beings as objects or as a set of predetermined reactions. As Mary Warnock, in one of her little delightful books on existentialism, observed, there is nothing which is more crucial to existentialism than the belief that we can know only what we live. So we know we are free because we experience our own freedom in anguish. So in other words, sort of what Sartre is leading up to in this lecture and what he really states is that to understand, a man must find out and experience for himself. So the emphasis is very much on experiencing. But there are some problems with Sartre's celebration or elaboration of his idea of freedom. The central role that existentialism gives to freedom does not mean that it is actually a philosophy of freedom. We can does talk about freedom, gives a central, doesn't mean to say it is a philosophy of freedom. Because ironically, his broad and indeterminate representation of freedom can lead in a roundabout way to a fatalistic reworking of the idea. So if you take the logic of existentialist ideas, the logic can be, if you want to go down that road, I'm not saying one needs to go down that road, but it's something that is imminent in his writing. Choice is no longer a right that may or may not be exercised. Human beings cannot not choose. We were discussing this earlier on in Tim Black's discussion of Sartre's novels. You haven't got the choice of not choosing. Not choosing is a choice. Human beings cannot not choose. And arguably, freedom becomes a condition of existence that is imposed on humanity. It's not something that we've in any way chosen or responsible. It is imposed upon us. According to him, freedom is a basic fact of existence. We represent, says Sartre, freedom with choices, but we could not choose to be free. And he says we are doomed to freedom. We are thrown into freedom. And not choosing, as he said, is, as I said earlier on, just as much a choice as choosing. Avoiding action is action too. So basically, when you have an idea of freedom, which has no ideal, no precedence, and this very strong, indeterminate quality, then you do end up with almost like a kind of a heavy-handed, coercive idea of how freedom is, not just the way it is experienced. In a view that he expresses that's very much the opposite to what he said earlier on about Kant and moral autonomy. He says, respect for freedom of one's fellow man is idle chatter. Even if we could do so plan that we honor this freedom, such an attitude would be a violation of the freedom which we are so busy respecting. So basically, what I'm trying to get at is that his cynical view, and it could be considered cynical, that there are no unfree acts has significant resemblance to the view that there are no free acts. If there are no unfree acts, if every act is free, then that's not a million miles away from the deterministic counterpoint, which is that there are no free acts. What Lukács wrote was that, like the determinist, Sartre reduces human phenomena to one level. And Lukács goes on and says, but determinism is at least a system, verifiable in part, where Sartre's free acts are a disconnected, fortuitous conglomeration. And I do think that that is the weak side of Sartre, the indeterminate, unconnected from a freedom, the almost freedom kind of hovering over us in a semi-transcendental kind of a way. The hypothesis of freedom is itself one that has in its supposition the absence of choice, where choice itself becomes something that is not an act of volition anymore, but becomes in some shape or form disconnected to that. Nevertheless, if you take the weak side of Sartre and the strong side of Sartre and you kind of balance things out, one can say that there is a legitimate aspiration that is striving to come out from this struggle with the human condition on the part of Sartre. And certainly, without question, the emphasis on the individual's decision was really an important one at a time when it was being undermined both by mainstream determinism and also by vulgar Marxism. I think the understanding that Sartre is trying to develop, that all social activity is made up of the action of individuals, and no matter how society, the influence of society, no matter how decisive the influence of society, biology, material reality, their impact doesn't extinguish the capacity of individuals to make those kinds of decisions, sort of was really quite important. And I think what I take away from sort of Sartre, when you sort of weigh everything up, is a situation where instead of allowing objectivity and impersonal forces to have this dominating, predominant kind of position, there's an important sort of space left out for the making, for the transforming of people's circumstances and the making of history. I think, in a sense, when Sartre sort of denied prior human essence and made the point that humanity is made through our existence and action, he made a very important point. And the point was that if humanity begins with existence and not with essence, then existence itself, the how existence itself is supposed to be constituted, is no longer something or a state that could be objectified. It's no longer a state that could be accounted for in kind of non-human kind of ways. It itself is the making of humanity and the human being. And in that sense, we have a very different conception of consciousness. I just want to end by contrasting Sartre with all his blemishes and all his weaknesses and his strengths to today. And what I'm going to do is just quote to you a newspaper article I read last week in the New York Times. Because when I was preparing my lecture, I said to myself, I'm going to do something I've never done before. I'm not going to write the end of the lecture. I just want to find what it is that comes, not because I'm lazy, which I am, but because I want to find something in the world around me. There must be something. If what I'm saying is right, there's got to be something in the world around us that I could use to put in relief what Sartre is doing. And so what I did was I got this kind of Google just sort of kind of mechanism where articles are alerted about kind of existence and things like that. And I was very interested to see what people would say. What would be an authoritative rendition of these kinds of issues today? And luckily, because I could have ended up with an obituary or something, luckily I came across an article that was written in the New York Times by a well-known sociobiologist, Edward Wilson. And I think I just want to read a few things from in the way that he sees the same kind of question. He begins the article by saying, "Don't get me wrong, I'm not implying that we are driven by instinct in the manner of animals." So, phew, relief. You know, it's good to know that we're not laboratory rats. Yet, in order to understand the human condition, it is necessary to accept that we do have instincts. And it will be wise to take into account our very distant ancestors, as far back and in as fine a detail as possible. History, he says, is not enough to reach this level of understanding. Right? It's an interesting statement. I mean, this is not something that people would have dared say in the 19th century. History is not enough to reach this level of understanding. It stops at the dawn of literacy, where it turns the rest of the story over to the detective work of archaeology. In still deeper times, the quest becomes paleontology. For the really human history, history makes no sense without prehistory, and prehistory makes no sense without biology. Very kind of clear statement. So we kind of move from history, which is bad enough. We move into prehistory, which is not cool, but you know. And now we're back in biology. I've even go back to biology. And then he says, within biology itself, the key to the mystery is the force that lifted pre-human social behavior to the human level. The leading candidate, in my judgment, is multi-level selection, by which hereditary social behavior improves the competitive ability not of just individuals within groups, but among groups as a whole. Its consequence can be plainly seen in the caste system of ants, termites, and social insects. So we now move back to the, not just to the animal world, but to the insect world. You know, sort of. And then he kind of goes on and on and on and on, and you know, sort of discusses various kind of issues. And basically he says, he concludes the article by saying, risking oversimplification. I wonder what Kierkegaard would have made of this. He says, risking oversimplification, individual selection promoted sin, while group selection promoted virtue. I love that. I think it is basically what is interesting about all these theories is it's kind of reading history backwards. It's all about saying, well, this is the present state. What was it in the past that worked inexorably towards this particular moment? It's almost that kind of teleology reverse, sort of that kind of we're seeing here. A kind of is there a word for predestination in reverse, where you kind of go backwards and you discover, the way I understand my sin is by looking at a bunch of ants, sort of competing for the same breadcrumb or something like that. That's the way it's just kind of posed. And it seems to me that these kinds of sentiments, are not just simply the odd expressions of isolated individuals. They are very much within the mainstream of the world that we're living in. I'm not sure how Sartre would have reacted to this. Probably would have just gone and have another cigarette or something like that. But certainly, what I take from Sartre, and the reason why I'm delighted that he was around to smoke his cigarettes and take his barbiturates and all the rest of the stuff that he was meant to have done, is that at this particular moment in time, and just at this particular moment of time, a voluntarist development of the idea of freedom becomes necessary. There are moments in history when the act of will, as much confined by external circumstances as is, as much thwarted by human limitations as has always been the case, is still very necessary, and probably more necessary than in recent memory. And it seems to me that a voluntaristic development of the idea of freedom can draw upon some of the resources that kind of Sartre in particular left behind. I don't have the same amount of respect for some of the other so-called existentialists. I think Sartre was a person who genuinely struggled in a kind of future-oriented way that is perhaps distinguishes him from some of his predecessors. And I suppose the one lesson that I draw from Sartre, and it should have emerged from the discussion in the last few days, is that freedom is not something that we can take for granted. It's not something that is a gift that we can put in our pockets, walk away, feel satisfied that we have. And I just want to end up by reminding ourselves of one important point that existentialists like Sartre made in a completely uncompromising black and white kind of a way, something that we very rarely take on board and accept as our own. And the one point on which he was certainly right, more right than Lukács was, as it happens, is that freedom, real freedom, needs to be lived. It needs to be lived. And that's something that we in this room have got to think about, how we can learn to live freely. Right? It's not something that we need to think about in the conventional way of a political freedom, which is all as important as it is, not just simply in the kind of grand philosophical sense. Freedom is something that we need to live in order to give that meaning. And one of the things that I take away from Sartre is that through our own example, through our own behavior, through an act of will, being free can be an infectious state of existence that is likely to capture the imagination of other human beings who also, somewhere in the middle of their persona, share this very, very human aspiration. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much, Frank. I can't look at my... Right, thank you very much. Over to you. Let's just see if anyone wants to speak. Okay, so Richard, back.
Thanks, and thanks very much for that, Frank. Very, very sort of lucid about existentialism. Now, I want to make it very, very clear, I'm actually very much a believer in free will. But I think we are now in the 21st century, and we can't afford to be just simply dismissive of the biological and the neuroscience work on origins of human behaviour, human volition, and so on. And dismissiveness, it seems to me, is the wrong response. If we're going to continue to believe in free will, if we're going to continue to be existentialists, if that's what we happen to be, then we have got to take into account the new theories that are coming out of biology and neuroscience, and incorporate or if appropriate counter them, not in a dismissive way, but in a way that actually explains how the arguments that are being put forward there, the determinist arguments, are actually false.
Thanks. Yeah.
Yeah, okay. Yes, I first of all totally agree with the having to live freedom. In fact, it struck me in the last two sessions that we use freedom as an abstract noun, and actually it ought to be a verb, to be free, because that's when it becomes something real and lived, as you say. The question I've got, it links a bit to the point at the front, which I would have to disagree with really strongly, about not needing to dismiss neuroscience. It's to what extent should we accept the kind of dualistic separation of objectivity and subjectivity? As you said, Frank, at one point, you know, objectivity shouldn't be allowed to determine our, I think it was experiential agency, or our subjectivity in lived experience. But that does, to me, that's accepting the kind of, if you like, the distortion of objectivity. And I thought one of the really nice things about one of the Kant readings was how it showed that in the objective there is a subjective there. You know, you cannot have the two separated, and it's done in that form of that lovely, like a maths question. You know, 5 plus 7 equals 12. That's seen as a totally logical, rational, up there, abstract thing, but actually that involves experience to understand that. There's nothing about 12 that comes from just logic. It can only come from experience itself. And the thing about the neuroscience, the biology and the archaeology, paleontology, and biology that are today used to trash human subjectivity. But does that mean that surely that doesn't mean that those things in and of themselves are negative, because they have, you know, there's another kind of interpretation which would say that the very existence of those disciplines, of those forms of thought, is testament not to our diminishment, but testament to our accomplishment and our power.
Okay, thanks. So I'm just going to take 2 more people before I take Frank. So yes, there, and then there.
On this point about freedom needing to be lived, it seems to me really a very attractive thing to aspire to, and I think it's something that draws me very much to some of the reading that I've been doing about existentialism. But there's a part of me that is also really responds back from it, and sees it as being very close to the whole notion of the personal being political, and the way that you live your life being a demonstration of your politics, which it seems to me was very much a sense of what came out of existentialism. And I feel that the way that I've understood it so much is that the personal decisions that we take are not necessarily an expression of the political context in the way in which we see things. So a woman doesn't have an abortion as an expression of being pro-choice, or we don't have children as an expression of being pro-natalist. We're not heterosexual as a statement about our views on sexuality. So I'm just troubled by this notion of existence as an expression of what we are and a political context.
Okay, thanks. And then finally, before I bring Frank in, and then I'll start back with Mark.
I think my question follows on from that. I've not really worked it out in my own mind, but my question is it enough to have a voluntaristic idea of freedom? I take your points about the determinism and all that, but there is also another trend in society, which is that an incredibly subjective preoccupation with the self. For example, a friend of mine told me she'd recently been reading a book by Ono called Freedom, Freedom and the Self. I'm not sure exactly what the title was. And she discovered spirituality, and I asked her what the content of that spirituality was, and she couldn't really explain it. And I said, you know, for me, spirituality is about my relationship between others in society. And she said, why are you talking about society? Why do you need to belong to society? And I just didn't know what to say. And Because if you don't feel that you belong to society as a member of society, then how can your freedom have any meaning?
Okay, thanks. So, Frank, if you have to go there, sorry.
All right. I'm not arguing that volunteers' orientation towards freedom is the end of the story, because that could be a very one-sided way of dealing with a variety of problems that confronts us. What I'm really trying to argue is that the attitude of volunteerism, the attitude of living freedom, is the precondition. It's like the basis on which sort of everything else is founded upon. In other words, it's a disposition towards the world that still requires us to, for example, come to an agreement about what kind of values, what kind of ideals we put forward to the attention of our fellow citizens as something that we need to strive toward. That doesn't solve the problem. It's not an answer to the problem. It merely is the point of departure to the way that one needs to deal with the world today. And the reason for that is because so much of what we do is based upon sparing us of the responsibility of making decisions. You know, if you're a teacher in a school, you're spared of the responsibility and the hassle of deciding what you're going to teach on that particular day. You've got a curriculum with very clear, sort of indication as to what should be done. If you're in business or if you're working in a university, you have an ethics committee that spares you of the responsibility of making a judgment about what your research is going to be about. When you think of the way that our world is organized, it's continually there and organized in such a way as to relieve us of the faculty of judgment, of choice, of willing, the act of willing. That's not something that, how many business plans do you see that says, we want our employers to will and to make voluntary choices? That's not how these things work. It's very opposite. So I think under those circumstances, when we are deprived of this, then it's going to be reconstituted. And the reason for that, I would suggest, and this is something that's in a sense implicit in what Sartre says, at least according to my interpretation, is that it's through living freedom that people gain the insights and the understanding of the problems that confront them, and it's through living freedom that we learn to communicate with each other, so that we don't have an artificial relationship to each other, but it's based upon acts of communications that are freely put forward into the public domain. So I think in that sense, that's what I'm getting at. And I'm not talking about the personal being political. I'm not arguing for a personal kind of politics. I'm merely saying that we have a responsibility as individuals. It's not something that we can just leave to the future when there's a whole bunch of us who wake up one morning and we all spontaneously draw the same conclusion. It's something that we have got to account for and make a measure of ourselves. I have a problem with ideals of determinism and the way that science is. And my problem is that I've got no problem with the science. I've never once criticized neuro-science. I'm not so sure what evolutionary psychology. I think that's a bullshit science, sort of. But I think biology, I have no problem with. Genetics, no problem with. I think that those achievements that those scientists that have made are really very, very important. I think that there is no reason why scientific advance should create a problem for any kind of freedom-oriented attitude. I mean, freedom and science are not in any way antithetical. Freedom becomes a problem for scientists who pose their findings in a way that's causally promoted. In other words, once science makes claims to show the causes of what goes on in the world, then we run into problems. Once there's a kind of pre-existent causality that's been put in place, which overrides the interaction between subjectivity and objectivity, then we do run into problems, because what we then have is a kind of human condition that's stripped bare of any of its human kind of input. Anyway, as you're suggesting, the implicit in what you're saying is that the very fact that we have these great sciences indicate that somewhere along the way they didn't evolve from chimpanzees. They were actually acts of human beings who, through their human capacity for imagination, have discovered a lot of these things. So I don't think there's a problem there. I think what we're faced with is that even if evolutionary biology didn't exist, neuroscience didn't exist, if every single neuroscientist died and the science were wiped out, there would be something like, the science of the brain, which would determine everything that we do, that would be put forward, because there's a demand for this. So it's the demand for a priori arguments, a demand for objectified arguments, that is the problem. And that's really what I think that one needs to kind of object to. And if what you're saying is that we need to have a subtle engagement with neuroscience, I'm all for that. And maybe there's some people in the room who can be more subtle than I am, and actually understand the science. I think it's interesting that whenever I do talk to neuroscientists, they always reassure me that, don't worry, Frank, it's not us who are saying that. It's people who interpret our findings who are making those kinds of claims. So there is hope yet that one day, sort of science and a more humanist, a more kind of existentialist intellectual movement can cooperate, converge, and collaborate in a way that benefits everybody.
Okay, thanks. So I'm starting here, please, and then hands in the air.
Thank you.
Right at the back.
I wonder if you could say more, Frank, on this point you made about there being no unfree acts, or your problem with that formulation, and how it mirrors the deterministic side of there being no free acts. Because it seems that in the way that you're talking about freedom in this existential sense, it being something sort of not economic, like we were perhaps talking about yesterday, but it seems to be inseparable, completely bound up with consciousness. And as you said in your introduction, you can't stop the world. You can't say, stop the world, I want to get off. You can't stop being conscious. So it seems that you can't stop making choices. It seems that you are obliged always to act. And so I wonder whether, although living freedom is a tiring thing, so you're constantly having to live this freedom, it does seem that the idea that there's no unfree acts means there's no unconscious acts, because the freedom and consciousness being inseparable. So I just wonder whether you could say a bit more about that formulation and why you find it a problem.
Okay, thanks. So there, Patrick, but then that person there.
Yeah, it's kind of following on from that, because of course the way in which Sartre does observe, when people get tired of being free, they adopt what Sartre calls, choose to adopt what Sartre calls bad faith. And I was hoping you could kind of talk about that a bit, because in some ways it's far more positive than, say, Marcuse's or Lukács' idea of kind of false consciousness in a way, because it is still a choice to adopt this position of bad faith, where you kind of you deny that kind of innate freedom that you have, and kind of act in an inauthentic way instead. So I wonder really whether or not you think bad faith is a useful concept, and whether or not it's something that we perhaps see quite a lot of today in the kind of attempt to kind of reduce human consciousness to neuroscience, or to take that kind of reductionist approach. So I was hoping you could speak a bit on that.
So the guy at the end there, and yes, that's fine for us.
It seems the key issue we're dealing with here is how our more, say, our animal natures, neurons, circuitry, and genes relates to the subjective I, which is the seat of, or the Kantian subjective I, which is like the seat of our freedom. So the question is, firstly, is freedom something unique to humans, and therefore animals are determined by their neuroscience? And then, if that is the case, then how does our subjective, the I, my freedom, relate to my, my animal kind of body and neurons and things like that? So is freedom a sliding scale? Does it radically change it, or is it just like a perfection, or say an extra thing on, if you see what I'm saying?
Okay, there, and then next, Dolan after you, please. Yeah.
Okay, a light-hearted suggestion relating to some of the things covered in this and other sessions across the weekend. Claire's talk yesterday about the Brontes and so on, which I took to be about literature of constraint and dealing with, struggling with the constraints of society. I was thinking after that about what the modern equivalents would be, and the first thing that came to mind was The Wire, which people will know. It's all about institutions thwarting of people's attempts to improve things. Everybody knows about that. I don't want to go on about it too much. What's more interesting, I think, is the show that's the mirror image of The Wire, which is The Shield. And the reason why I say that is I think it's the only show I can think of that's explicitly about free will, embodied in the form of a LA policeman who routinely takes bold, decisive, risky moves, and then has to deal with the consequences, the unforeseen consequences, in the way that Frank was talking about on the very first session, in a very interesting way. He's doing it for selfish reasons. It all ends horribly, but nevertheless, I think there might be some food for thought in there. And if you're looking for some practical examples of trying to express free will in the modern world, you could do worse than rent a box set.
Thanks, Dolan.
Yeah, I just wonder if you could elaborate a bit on your objection to the idea that there's no such thing as unfree decisions, that kind of flip side. I'm just not sure I completely follow, but I can certainly see a certain logic there. And when you said you can't get off the earth or stop the earth, it makes me think of what Jean Cocteau said about opium. You could take for drug addiction more generally, that life is like an express train running towards death, and to take opium is to leap from the moving train, to choose something that's neither life nor death. Of course, we can say that's a decision too. You could choose to take drugs and to drop out of life, but I wonder if it makes sense to look at degrees of responsibility, where in that case, the culpable act is opting out, trying not to take responsibility, which is different from the kind of responsibility you might hold people to for more deliberate actions.
Okay, thanks. So, Kevin, I think, and then I'll take you here, and then Frank, I'll see if you want to say anything, and I'll take the last round.
Yeah, I have a slight problem in that, I understand the point that you're arguing about freedom. Doesn't that have real problems for morality, though? In that you have, what you're essentially arguing for is an individuation of morality, and that you need to have judgment on any action that you take. Otherwise, it fails to have any meaning whatsoever. What's going to constitute the judgment if you get rid of the whole, as Sartre seems to do, get rid of the entire situation? You have this constant erosion of meaning. The only way I can see forward from it is that morality must be constructed in hindsight, that you take the action and gamble that it's actually going to be understood as a good action as opposed to a bad action. And that there's no way of telling that beforehand, and that seems to be a bit of a problem with what you're describing.
Sally.
I think my question does carry on a bit from what Dolan was saying, and it is also about this idea of doing nothing is in effect a choice as well, or freedom as well. Because what is surely the difference between doing nothing and posing that as a choice and doing something actively, more consciously, is that doing nothing in effect is passivity, really, and does not require you to take the same responsibility for your actions that just doing nothing implies. And I think when you look today at what is increasingly going on around the formalisation, we've discussed before, the formalisation of personal relationships and relationships between people, then it seems all the time that what's happening through that is this kind of process is replacing this idea of process. This is a process that you should follow, replaces the idea of taking responsibility for any actions that you might or that you have in your personal relations with other people, bringing up children, or at work with colleagues. And I just wondered maybe if you could comment on that, on the relationship between freedom and responsibility, I suppose, a bit more in passivity.
Okay, thanks. Frank, we'll start back with Helen, and then I'll go back.
Well, I think we need to take, I mean, I'm not a philosopher, and the fact that I'm not a philosopher is also a conscious choice on my part not to be a philosopher, because, you know, sort of, I take the view that if you take philosophical concepts too far and give it a dynamic of its own, it turns in on itself. And what I'm really worried about is if you take, I mean, in this case, we're talking about freedom, and totally turn it into this almost like an existential, you know, sort of state, then it loses any of its liberating potential. So that I make a distinction between living freedom, which is what I sign off to a conception where freedom is life. Freedom becomes life itself, where it almost acquires a fairly trite, take it for granted way, but there's also dangers that I think any philosophical concept pushed too far is always dangerous in terms of its consequences. So, for example, if you take the idea that, you know, that every act, you know, is freely willed, you know, or if you take, if you basically imply that we're always making choices, even when we're not making choices, and you push it too far, then some of the arguments that have been made recently, for example, like there's no such thing as civilians, therefore everybody is fair game, is a philosophically legitimate one, even though it's got all kinds of barbaric kind of consequences. And I think that one of the things that we need to understand is that, you know, it's in the very nature of concepts that if you free them from reality, then they can serve the most degraded, destructive kind of ends. And we don't want to end up in this, what does become nihilistic in the end, because it becomes so distant from any kind of values that, you know, you do end up with a problem. So that's my own one kind of reservation. I also think that, you know, sort of that the importance that we attach to freedom is something that is linked to the values that we try to construct. So Kevin says, you know, that the logic of this is an individualistic morality, and you could draw that conclusion if you just leave it at that kind of in a kind of limited way. But if you assume that the reason why you're concerned with living freedom is because you now want to establish freedom as a foundation, a normative foundation for value making, right? Which is what I would, you know, I would want to argue. Then what you can do is that through through the communication of your action and through the intellectual and kind of moral consequences that kind of come out of that, you can go into the business of making values that are, you know, not consciously making morality, because that never works. You can't really fabricate kind of morality, but you can, through that, you know, sort of behave in what is a kind of a moral kind of a way, and that's really how I would say that, you know, the jumping off point is freedom. That's the jumping off point, the point of departure, and where you get to is something, you know, we'll decide. As you say, there is an element of, you know, doing it through action rather than, you know, working out a moral code sort of beforehand. It doesn't mean to say that we begin with nothing, because we take with us, our own intellectual and cultural preconceptions, and we distill that and crystallize some of its best side along the way. I'm very uncomfortable with the triple concepts of bad faith, false consciousness, and inauthentic beings. And I think that the reason why I'm very uncomfortable with these concepts is because they represent a kind of a perspective, a perspective and a judgment that seems to have a kind of a force of its own. And sort of the attribution of false consciousness assumes the posture of true consciousness, which, from my experience, tends to be made by people whose consciousness is as false as the ones they criticize. And similarly, a kind of a Heideggerian condemnation of inauthenticity is made by somebody whose track record in the interwar period and Second World War does put into question his sort of authentic sort of kind of humanist kind of credentials. And similarly with bad, I think of all these concepts, possibly bad faith is now and again I use bad faith, but I'm not really, I wouldn't want to write a book about it and say it's a wonderful concept, for the very simple reason that it kind of, there's a kind of a smug assumption behind it, a kind of comfortable smugness about who it is that you kind of attributing it to. And I don't think we need these kinds of concepts because it distracts us from finding our own way and in the making of judgments, which is where we should be going.
Can we leave it there for a minute so we get some more people? Right. I'm going to continue to the back. So I'm basically there, and then I've got there and there.
Okay, so you partly answered this, but I just wanted to come back to the question of values, because if Sartre is saying that there are no values and there's no values or order to legitimize our conduct, but where do our values come? I mean, are values worth having then? And if they are, where do they come from? I mean, I find the values that Kant outlines pretty convincing. I mean, they seem a good way to live your life. Do no harm to others. Do unto others as you. That seems a pretty good starting point for values. But is that something that has to come out of living freely? But if a free life is not the objective, then surely values have some role. So how do we evolve our values? Can we take them from, Kant or develop them? I just don't quite see how we can create our own value system. Or is that just outside the realm of philosophy? It's something we have to do as a practical question.
How did Sartre exercise his freedom in the context of Nazi occupation? And how would he account for the behaviour of Jews when they were dispatched to concentration camps? Did he think they were acting freely, or did he admit that their behaviour was being determined in some way for them? In fact, how did he account for the behaviour of the Jews in that context?
Okay, thanks. Yeah.
But there's no conflict between science and freedom. Freedom consists of the ability to cause your behaviour. You can look at that in two different ways. You can look at it subjectively, experiencing that causal ability, and we call that the experience of free will, or the scientists may hope to look at that causal relationship by scientific methods. They're two methods of looking at the same thing. There's no conflict. Indeed, if we could not cause our own behaviour, and our behaviour was random, you would hardly think that morality could apply to it.
Okay, thanks. So I'm going to go back now to Alan, then Angus, and then I'll come up to Niall and Ellie. Oh yes, okay. Great.
Well, what I found so exciting about this weekend is looking back at some of the thinkers and philosophers and trying to explore them and take from them the best of what they offered. and then begin to think about our own morality, obviously what logically applied and was true then, but also drawing on the best of that for now. And I think you've done it with Sartre, interestingly, because if we were forced to be free, I got a bit confused between the forced to be free and then choosing to act. But I'll go with the choosing to act and have the will to be free in today's terms. It was interesting that you mentioned Wilson, because I think today things are very confusing, because in Wilson's letter to a pastor, he combines an absolutely beautiful, apparently humanist secular argument about why reason and justice should apply to all of us, with then a denunciation in effect of humanity. And why we're destined to kill ourselves, and why all religious people and everyone should get together. So things do become very convoluted today, it seems to me, in some of these discussions, and so to the point about science and scientism. And I think that the neuroscience obviously positive and very good, but scientism bad, taking away from the idea of human will and consciousness. So just finally on living free, it seems to me that that's about human autonomy and the question between freedom and authority. And I really liked what Roger Scruton said at the end of his speech, when he said, when things are not guaranteed or sometimes seem to be unprovable, sometimes we have to take intellectual gambles.
Okay, thanks. So I've got Angus and then Niall. Then I'll go to Craig and then Ellie, and that's it. And then
But I think sometimes the experience, the real experience of unfreedom can lead to breakthroughs in our understanding of the nature of being free. And so doing philosophy in a prison camp under Nazi occupation in France was, in some senses, I think, a liberating moment for somebody who wanted to try and understand our freedom in a paradoxical way. It does, of course, lead to some of the heavy metaphors of being condemned to be free. Camus saying that man exists on death row. We're all under a mass death sentence. But maybe in a slightly more positive note, in that same lecture, when Sartre says we do not need hope to do our work, I think there can be something liberatory about that. We don't need good faith to do our work. We just have to do our work. We have a life to lead irrespective of the death that we will die, and you have a project, if you choose to do so, to make something of that life and really not worry about the death part of it, because that's the inevitable non-chosen part of it. Maybe rather than being condemned to be free, in today's circumstances we might better express the necessity for people to be determined to be free, because without such self-determination there's really no way of living other than in a stifling conformity in the realm of dead dogma, living in a world of other people's choosing.
Okay, thanks. So, yeah, Craig, next.
Just
Sorry,
on living freedom, I was having a conversation over lunch about the problem of what we were talking about as self-censorship, and why so many people in the workplace and in social life find it difficult to, or it's difficult to get an opinion out of people over any kind of issues these days, and what was driving that. And we were talking about the idea of political correctness and the ideas of giving offence, and that's normally the way I think about things of late. You know, people are afraid to say what they think, but for a while there's just been a nagging at the back of my head that that's not really. It's not like people are really biting their tongue, holding back their opinions. And from what Frank was saying, it starts to make a bit more sense to me that maybe it is just more that people are just deciding not to take responsibility because of the culture of our times. You know, and Sally talked about it earlier as well, about the procedural aspects of society, that people are just disengaging and just not taking responsibility. I know sometimes if I decide I don't really want to engage in something, I'll just switch off, and maybe it's more that, it's just we are kind of unfreeing ourselves from the world, if you like. So I think it was kind of around that, really.
Okay, thanks. Craig, do you want to come in, Leslie? Craig and then Ali, and then Frank.
how to positively affirm freedom in the absence of God was the problem that confronted Sartre. You know, how to affirm freedom in the absence of values. But the problem today is that, you know, our problem is how to affirm freedom when we've got a multiplicity of values, but they're configured in fundamentally anti-human terms. So I just wondered, you know, how that might be achieved. You know, we've got tons and tons of values, but they're fundamentally anti-human. So, you know, how do we exercise freedom to confront that problematic?
It was just a comment on the proximity of freely choosing how to live one's life or advocating that for others, and the beginnings of developing a normative foundation for morality. Because I think that the minute you seek to live freely or advocate the right of others to do so, then the whole reality of the fact that you raise the question of how should we live our lives and what is the right way to live our lives immediately raises itself in a very open and upfront sort of way. I think in areas to do with raising children, this is manifest the minute you look at examples. So a previous discussion we had on freedom, the issue was raised of the family of the Shonrocks who took the simple act of letting their children ride to school because they thought that was the right way for their kids to get to school. And the minute they did so and others upheld their right to freely choose, a whole discussion was raised about what should be the normative underpinnings of family life and its relationship to other social institutions. I think similarly, the minute you attempt to speak freely or defend the right of others to speak freely, immediately a discussion is raised about normative values, and as a culture and as a society, what should our values be? So I think that, to me, it seems very apparent that the two simply go hand in hand, and the more we find ways of actively asserting the right to live freely and the right of others to do so, that is the absolutely clearest way to begin a productive discussion about, you know, a question of morality and what our values as a culture should be.
Thanks. Frank.
I mean, some very difficult questions have been posed, but I think the way to confront them is to understand that it's not as if we live in a value-free world. You know, there are values in the air, and people talk about different versions of what is good and what is bad. But the important and distinct feature of this discussion is that these are values that are very feebly held. These are values that don't touch us, and certainly don't touch us all the time. And therefore, they are to some extent external to us. And one of the problems that we have is that, you know, even those values that are in the air that I or you would think are quite good are subverted by a very procedurally oriented, sort of world. So, for example, you and I are not allowed to make a judgment about what is good and what is bad in our workplace. It's not something that we can make, because, as you know, to make a value judgment requires a specific act of judgment in response to a specific context, a specific event. And that's really what we're not allowed to do anymore, because there's got to be a process through which you go, which the last thing it wants to do what is to make discriminating distinctions about this specific instance as opposed to some other ones, because there's got to be a generic, all-purpose sort of answers to all these kinds of questions. So, in that sense, it's not that there are no values, but the values are extremely weak. There is no cultural affirmation for them, and we kind of forced to fall back upon sort of essentially formal solutions to what are in fact normative problems. So how do what does one do in that circumstance? Now, I don't think that we got an answer for that as a kind of an answer that you can just send out in a mail shot to the whole world and say this is what you need to do. I think there are different strategies that you can adopt. The strategy that I've adopted, which I think certainly is very important for me, and certainly I think it's something I would advocate to all friends to kind of try out, is something I've outlined in my last book on tolerance, where basically the argument that I'm trying to tease out from this is that one of the most important things that we need to popularize and to practice, and corresponds most closely to living freedom, is the promotion of the old Greek virtue of judgment, the old Greek virtue of phronesis, where, as you know, Aristotle argued that that is the most basic virtue of all, making practical judgment, where we are live our lives by being free to make judgments, and are expected to make judgments, in a response, and educating ourselves. We've got to be educated to make those kinds of judgments about life. And there is one thing, I mean, at first sight it seemed like a very trivial point to make. Oh yeah, what is this? But actually, the capacity to make judgments, is something that is violated all the time in terms of the way that institutionally our world works. We don't want doctors to make judgments any more than we want teachers to make judgments. Because making a judgment call is now seen as a highly risky kind of enterprise. You have whole industries of risk managers and risk assessment who are just there to make sure that they've done all the statistical analysis that tells you what you should do rather than you doing that judgment yourself. And the reason why this is important is not only because it's a very important virtue in its own right, but it's only through the practice of making judgments that we become moral beings. That's how we gain, that's how we become not just, human beings, but moral beings. That's a certain moral sensibility that kind of approximates the present moment begins to evolve. And that's really my solution, and may not work, but I think it's really worth trying out because it is something through which living freedom can be more than rhetoric. It could really be something that is actually quite exciting and can involve a lot of other people. I want to go back to one little point beforehand, which is back to this science point. Even if it turns out that science has got this incredible capacity to influence different forms of behavior, I still think it's important to realize that there's a distinction and this is what distinguishes us from animals and from inanimate objects and whatever, which is that we don't just simply act on our instincts. We're not just instinctual beings. Science can explain our instincts. I've got no doubt about it, that science can go a long way to explain our instincts. We don't just simply act on our desires, because desire is a more culturally informed aspect of our instincts. In other words, we're not just beings who are dominated by desire. And I think science can tell a lot about our desires. I think brain science is able to explain a lot about why we desire, a lot. Even though desire is a more mediated form, more culturally mediated form of behavior. We also are decision makers. So we don't just act on our instincts, we don't just simply act on desire, we also make decisions about how we act. And I think that when it comes to decision making, there's a realm of freedom that opens up where science has got no role to play, where science has got no legitimate activity, and it's there really where freedom kind of comes into its own. And similarly, I mean, we haven't got time that's getting on, there's a distinction between human beings, the human species, about which science can say a lot, maybe even everything, and persons and personhood, because we're also persons, we're not just simply members of a biological species, about which science has got very limited amount to say. Maybe psychologists don't get to say here and there. And I think what I'm really trying to get at is that there are aspects of ourselves that we have made, not science, but we have made, where man makes man. Not just the values by which we live by, but man makes man. And I think that although seeing the world in a way where we understand the reciprocal interaction between our biology or the physical aspects of who we are and the kind of moral, cultural one is really quite a useful way of getting around some of these problems. I don't know what Sartre did exactly in the Second World War because there are different stories. He did sit in a prison camp for a while. I think it is quite interesting that Sartre and a lot of many of his colleagues only realized what a problem Nazism was after the event. Right? You didn't need a PhD in political science to understand in 1938, 1939 that there's a real problem there. You better do something about it. So they, although they did resist, they could have done it a little bit earlier, and maybe something good would have come out of the whole business. But that's, there's no point in reading history kind of backwards. But in the end, I don't think it really matters what individuals are who kind of set out on this road. What's really important is that we learn to take from them what is important for us. I think that's what intellectual life is all about. It's being open to the ideas of others and being able to learn from the experience of even those people with whom we disagree from time to time. And I think that's what we should be doing here as well. If we disagree with each other, if we criticize each other, if we resent what each of us has said, there is still something to be learned from each other's experiences. Even when people say things that are seen by us as being totally wrong, at the very least we can learn what led them to make those terribly false statements. I mean, that in itself is an education. Thank you.